Today on It Takes a Killer, when a wife and mother is gunned down in broad daylight just outside New Orleans, Louisiana, it initially appears to be yet another random act of violence in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. But security footage and eyewitnesses quickly reveal the shooting is a cold-blooded murder plot carried out by a respected member of the community nobody would ever suspect. Metairie, Louisiana, Thursday, August 31st, 2006, 3 p.m. 46-year-old respiratory therapist Mary Elizabeth Marinello enters Metairie Towers office building.
Liz has a regularly scheduled therapy session with social worker Mary Ann Catalanato.
After the counseling session, Liz exits the office building through the back door and walks across the parking lot to her SUV. As soon as she gets to her car, Liz fumbles around in her purse to get her keys out.
Liz is caught off guard when a man approaches. He invades her personal space and just stares at her without uttering a word.
The man pulls a revolver and fires 2 shots.
Inside Metairie Towers, businessman Stan Bundy hears the gunshots and looks out his office window just in time to spot a disheveled-looking old man pedaling away from the parking lot on a bicycle.
Seeing there's a woman lying on the asphalt, Stan grabs a couple of colleagues and they rush down to the parking lot. They find Liz Marinello still breathing, but unable to communicate, and they immediately dial 911.
First responders with the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office and the EMS arrive within minutes.
They find Liz Marinello on the ground with her purse still under her shoulder. Paramedics rush her to Charity Trauma Center 5 miles away. She's barely conscious.
Back at Metairie Towers, detectives walk the crime scene.
Initially, it looks like Liz Marinello could be the victim of a robbery gone wrong. There's been an uptick in crime as many residents displaced by Hurricane Katrina migrate back to New Orleans and its suburbs.
However, the keys to Marinello's SUV and her credit cards remain inside her purse.
The nature and precision with which Liz had been shot suggests to investigators that she'd been specifically targeted.
Detectives soon review security footage from the building's back parking lot.
They can see a bearded man wearing a blue, green, and black plaid flannel shirt arrive on a bicycle around 3:30 p.m.
The man never enters the office building. Instead, he just mills around. Interestingly, another woman exits the complex minutes before Liz Marinello, but the bearded man never approaches her.
At 3:53 p.m., the strange man starts moving toward Liz's vehicle.
At 3:56, Marinello appears on the security cameras as she leaves the building. By 3:57, it appears as though she's on the ground.
Around 6 o'clock that evening, Commander Dennis Thornton of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, or JPSO, speaks with counselor Mary Ann Catalanato.
Catalanato tells Thornton that for the past several months, she's been counseling Liz from 3 to 3:50 every Thursday to address anxiety and depression stemming from her marital problems.
Catalanato explains that Liz's husband, Vince Marinello, used to attend the meetings with Liz, but had stopped going once the marriage started heading for divorce.
The Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office has been trying to contact Vince ever since the shooting, but Vince hasn't returned their calls.
Law enforcement considers the possibility that Vince Marinello might be involved in his wife's shooting.
However, the 69-year-old radio broadcaster, who happens to be a local celebrity, has no facial hair and is known to be a sharp dresser.
As police continue attempting to reach Vince, his wife's ex-husband, Peter Caruso, makes repeated calls to him as well.
When Liz failed to pick up their 10-year-old daughter, Claire, from daycare, Caruso had received a call from a friend who works at Charity Trauma Center. Liz was there in critical condition and on life support.
Vince doesn't return calls to Caruso or the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office.
Doctors spend the evening fighting to save Liz Marinello's life. At 1:57 a.m., she's pronounced dead.
An autopsy is conducted later that morning. Liz Marinello suffered bullet wounds to the face just under her right eye. From those wounds, the medical examiner is able to remove fragments of blue-tip bullets coated in nylon.
These particular bullets have markings consistent with being fired from a .38 caliber Charter Arms revolver.
Meanwhile, around 10 a.m. on Friday, September 1st, Vince Marinello finally calls back the sheriff's office.
He explains that the reason he's been out of communication with everyone is because he was out of town and is just now heading back to New Orleans.
Before getting off the phone, Marinello agrees to meet with detectives later at the sheriff's office to give a statement.
Harvey, Louisiana, Friday, September 1st, 2006, 5 p.m. Vince Marinello and his attorney meet with homicide detectives at a sheriff's substation.
The detectives asked Vince where he was the time of his wife's shooting. Marinello explains that he spent the previous afternoon driving from his home, currently a FEMA trailer in the upscale Lakeview neighborhood in New Orleans to visit friends Dave and Annette Daniels in Byram, Mississippi.
Marinello claims that he left New Orleans between 3:15 and 3:30 that afternoon and didn't stop during the entire 175-mile drive until finally arriving at the Daniels' house.
Marinello claims he arrived in Byram around 6 p.m. to watch the Saints preseason NFL game on TV with Annette.
Detectives then ask Marinello how he learned that his wife had been shot.
Vince explains that he only found out about Liz's shooting after Annette received a call from her sister around 10 o'clock that night saying she'd seen on the news that Liz had been a victim of a shooting. Marinello admits that he never called the hospital to check on his wife's status, but he doesn't offer an explanation as to why he didn't.
Next, the officers ask Vince about his marriage.
Vince admits that he and Liz have recently been embroiled in an acrimonious divorce, which she filed for nearly 2 months prior in early July.
He tells the officers they'd gotten into a physical altercation which resulted in Liz being arrested.
Marinello says in no uncertain terms that he was not involved in the shooting that took her life.
Yet, Marinello does own a gun.
He admits that the previous month he'd purchased a 9mm handgun for protection, as his Lakeview neighborhood remains sparsely populated due to the 10 to 15 feet of flooding from Hurricane Katrina.
Byram, Mississippi, Saturday, September 2nd, 2006, 1:15 p.m. 2 Jefferson Parish Sheriff's investigators arrive at the Daniels' home. Vince had also shown up unexpectedly earlier that same day.
Vince voluntarily steps outside so that Annette and David can give statements to law enforcement.
Annette is interviewed first.
Annette explains that shortly after noon on the day of the shooting, Vince called her saying he was coming to watch the game that night.
According to Annette, Vince arrived at their house between 5 and 6 p.m., which is consistent with what he told law enforcement under questioning.
This timeline suggests it would have been virtually impossible for Vince to shoot his wife at 3:56 p.m., then drive 175 miles to arrive in Byram before 6 p.m.
Detectives questioned David Daniels, but he wasn't even home on the evening of August 31st. However, he does tell the officers that in the early 80s, he purchased a .38 Taurus revolver from Oshman Sporting Goods that his wife had given to Vince Marinello after Katrina.
Detectives go back to Annette. She flat out denies that she'd ever given Vince the revolver.
Less than 36 hours after Liz Marinello's murder, Jefferson Parish sheriffs execute a search warrant on her home in Harahan, Louisiana.
They're surprised to find nasty handwritten notes Vince had written his wife. The notes seem to indicate that Marinello was jealous, insecure, and borderline abusive.
Coming up, investigators unravel Vince Marinello's alibi, but is he the shooter? You're watching It Takes a Killer. On August 31st, 2006, 46-year-old Liz Marinello is gunned down in the parking lot outside her therapist's office. The prime suspect is an unknown bearded man on surveillance video, pedaling away from the scene on a bicycle. Within the first 48 hours, law enforcement begins to suspect that her husband, local sports broadcaster Vince Marinello, might be involved in the homicide.
On September 3rd, Liz Marinello's mother, Bertha Norman, gives a newspaper interview stating her belief that someone was hired to kill her daughter.
Even though the press found out that Liz had been arrested for domestic battery against Vince 3 weeks before the shooting, Bertha explains that Liz was the one in danger. Vince had actually assaulted her, leaving bruises family and friends had seen and could verify.
Law enforcement continues to investigate Vince.
In early September, detectives visit Oshman Sporting Goods to retrieve a receipt for the .38 Taurus revolver, which Vince's friend David Daniels said he had purchased back in the 80s and that his wife had given to Marinello.
Cops don't find documentation on the Taurus, but they do learn that Daniels purchased a .38 Charter Arms revolver in December 1985. Ballistic tests had indicated the bullets that killed Liz Marinello had been fired from a Charter Arms gun.
On September 5th, officers visit Elliott's small arms gun shop in Jefferson, Louisiana, where Vince claimed he recently purchased a 9mm handgun.
They recover a copy of Marinello's receipt for the 9mm purchase on August 8th. As detectives exit the store clerk, Alan Reese, shocks them by saying, "You probably recovered some 158 grain Nyclad ammunition from her face, didn't you?"
Information about these Nyclad bullets being retrieved from Liz Marinello's face at the autopsy had never been released to the public.
The detectives press the clerk for more.
Reese explains that back in July, Vince Marinello came into Elliott's with a .38 revolver that he wanted to test fire.
Vince also wanted to buy ammo. On Reese's suggestion, Marinello purchased the rare nylon-coated Nyclad bullets, which are so rare that Elliott's gun shop was the only store in Louisiana that sold them.
Acting on an anonymous tip, JPSO detectives then head to Vieux Carré hair shop in the Riverbend section of New Orleans.
Store clerk James Rizzuto tells the officers that Vince Marinello purchased a fake mustache from the store on August 22nd.
Police begin to question if the disheveled bearded man from the surveillance footage, who's believed to be Liz Marinello's killer, might actually be her husband, Vince.
On September 6th, investigators interview residents from the neighborhood surrounding the Metairie Towers office building.
Leonard Tubbs recalls hearing gunshots, then seeing a man in a flannel shirt with a scruffy beard and a hat pedaling away from the parking lot 20 to 30 seconds later.
The man headed east on Narcissus Street. Tubbs found it odd how warmly dressed the man had been, considering how hot it was outside.
Suzanne Klein tells investigators that she was driving home on August 31st when she observed a white, medium-sized sedan on Narcissus facing the canal with a bicycle parked alongside of it. 10 minutes later, she heard gunshots.
Mary Middleton observed the same vehicle parked in the same location around 1:30 p.m. She saw a white male riding a bike in the area later that day.
It seems clear that Liz Marinello's killer parked his getaway car on Narcissus 2 blocks away from the office building. Then, he rode his bike over to Metairie Towers, committed the shooting, pedaled back to the car, and drove off.
The authorities want to talk to Vince Marinello again.
Harvey, Louisiana, Wednesday, September 6, 2006, 5:44 p.m. Vince Marinello returns to the sheriff's office with his attorney for a second round of questions.
Vince confirms that over 20 years ago, Annette and David Daniels gave him a gun as a Christmas gift, but claims that he returned it to them shortly after receiving it. Vince maintains that he's never fired a gun in his life.
Vince also admits that he purchased the mustache at Vieux Carré, but says it was only to enhance his look. He claims he discarded it shortly after the purchase and denies having a costume beard of any kind.
Detectives ask Marinello if he owns a bicycle. Vince explains that he hasn't owned one in years because of back trouble.
When pressed about his August visit to Elliott's gun shop, Vince doesn't admit to owning any weapons that were test-fired, yet he does say he bought .38 caliber ammo for a gun he was considering buying.
At that point, Marinello's attorney terminates the interview.
That same evening, 2 detectives returned to Byram, Mississippi for a follow-up interview with Annette Daniels.
Annette now contradicts some of the statements she made before. First, she claims that Vince arrived on August 31st, not before, but after the Saints game, which kicked off at 7:30, had already started.
Annette explains that even though Vince did return the .38 caliber, she hasn't seen it since November 2004. That's when she moved it to a bathroom closet inside their home in Lakeview, which had been ravaged by Hurricane Katrina floodwaters.
According to Annette, Vince has had access to that home since Katrina and regularly checks on the residents.
Then, Daniels delivers one final bombshell.
Apparently on Tuesday, September 2nd, Vince had left behind some dirty clothes on the washing machine, which she'd just recently thrown in the garbage.
The officers seize the trash and find a green shirt with blue and black stripes, much like the clothing eyewitnesses had seen the presumed shooter wearing as he pedaled away from the crime scene.
Police turn up the heat on her husband, Vince.
On the evening of September 6th, authorities execute a search warrant on Marinello's FEMA trailer and his home in Lakeview. They also seize the white Ford Taurus loaner car he's been driving.
Inside Marinello's FEMA trailer, investigators collect clothing, checking account ledgers, a 9mm handgun, and ammo.
But there's a single piece of paper on the dining table that's particularly shocking.
It's a bulleted list of tasks that read like a murder checklist. Some of the bullet points say things like the gun, river on way to mama, mustache, okay, insurance money, none, clothes, burn.
The list also talks about painting the bike and includes several items that might be interpreted as part of a disguise, including gloves, black tennis shoes, sunglasses, and a white shirt.
On the back of the document, there's a diagram of the Metairie Towers parking lot.
Police issue an arrest warrant for Vince Marinello. He turns himself in without incident the following afternoon.
Jefferson Parish sheriffs continue gathering evidence against their prime suspect.
On September 8th, Metairie resident Stephen Marcello tells investigators that an orange men's bike had been left near his driveway around 4 p.m. on August 31st. Deputies go and recover the bike.
That same day, detectives speak to Patricia Whitey, the woman who appears on security video exiting Metairie Towers before Liz Marinello.
Whitey tells investigators that she saw a man with a fake-looking beard, jeans, a hat, and a long-sleeved flannel shirt milling around the parking lot. The man had worn leather skin, was around 6 feet tall, 175 to 180 pounds, and his bizarre appearance gave her cause for concern.
Another eyewitness, Spencer Harris, tells police that around 3:15 p.m., the same bearded white male got out of a Ford Taurus parked by the 17th Street Canal, then struggled to remove a bicycle from the rear. Harris observed the man ride the bike towards Metairie Road.
On Saturday, September 9th, the JPSO receives a call from a man named Dave Selmo, who worked on rehabbing Vince Marinello's house in late July and early August.
Apparently, when Marinello became aware of Selmo's extensive military background and firearms knowledge, he retrieved a vintage .38 caliber revolver from the house and asked Selmo if it could be equipped with a silencer.
In mid-September, a forensic team finally inspects the white Ford Taurus Marinello had been driving.
Tests reveal gunshot residue on the driver's side door, armrest, and a large portion of the steering wheel.
Meanwhile, on September 11th, Vince Marinello posts a $250,000 bond and is released from Jefferson Parish Jail.
Marinello lays low during the lead up to trial, as his story of a native son gone wrong dominates the local airwaves. Everyone wants to know what could have possibly brought him to the point where he's now suspected of murdering his wife.
Colleagues describe Vince as a real pro who's always dressed to the nines and purports himself as a man of wealth.
In February 2004, Vince is at New Orleans' famed rock and roll bowling alley when he spots Mary Elizabeth Norman.
Vince asks Liz to dance. He's still technically married to his second wife, Andrea, even though he would claim to have been divorced since 1982.
After the bowling alley encounter, Vince tracks Liz down. They begin to date, but the relationship is built on a series of lies from Marinello, including that he has mafia connections and a law degree from LSU.
8 months later, on October 23rd, they get married despite the fact that Vince's divorce from the second wife doesn't go through until the 26th.
The marriage seems doomed from the outset.
Before long, Liz discovers that her new husband has an egomaniacal side, which is clear from the nasty letters he writes her.
9 months into the marriage, Liz realizes that Vince is still paying some of his ex-wife Andrea's expenses through their joint checking account, which obviously amplifies tensions in the household.
On May 29th, Vince and Liz get into a physical altercation.
Liz has bruises which she shows her mother Bertha, maintaining that Vince pinned her against a wall, and the only way she could escape was to scratch and push him.
On July 6, 2006, Liz has an attorney draft divorce papers.
Despite filing for divorce, Liz starts to fear for her life, telling at least one friend that she feels like Vince is going to kill her.
The last straw comes on July 25th, when Liz discovers for certain that Vince had still been married when they tied the knot. She has her lawyer amend the divorce petition to ask for an annulment due to bigamy.
Vince responds by going to the DA and having Liz arrested on domestic violence allegations. On August 7th, she's booked by Harahan police on battery charges.
3 weeks later, someone, police believes Vince himself in disguise, guns down Liz Marinello in the parking lot of the Metairie Towers.
Coming up, the prosecution of Vince Marinello. In early December 2006, nearly 3.5 months after his wife had been shot leaving her therapist's office, a Jefferson Parish, Louisiana grand jury indicts 69-year-old sports broadcaster Vince Marinello on second-degree murder charges.
Because Marinello is a household name, the murder trial ends up being moved 135 miles away, where there's a better chance of obtaining an impartial jury.
Lafayette, Louisiana, Tuesday, December 2nd, 2008. The murder trial of Vince Marinello gets underway at Lafayette Parish Courthouse.
The prosecution's case is simple. Liz Marinello's killer, the gunman spotted by surveillance cameras and eyewitnesses, was none other than Vince Marinello in disguise.
The state alleges that Marinello parked his Ford Taurus within 3 blocks of where he knew his wife would be, then put on a disguise, retrieved his bike from the trunk, and rode it over to Metairie Towers. There, he shot Liz twice in the face before pedaling the same route back to his car and driving off.
Prosecutors present a series of witnesses who shine light on Marinello's odd behavior on the day of the shooting, as well as the days leading up to it.
Todd Meneses, the assistant program director at WWL, where Marinello worked, testifies that he saw Vince in the elevator on August 31st looking like a hobo, which he found strange considering how well-dressed Vince normally was.
PE teacher Lauren White, who works down the street from Metairie Towers at Metairie Academy, testifies that she saw a disheveled-looking man on a bike multiple times in the days leading up to August 31st. He was always headed towards Metairie Towers.
White tells the jury that on one occasion, this vagrant looked straight at her with scary eyes. When she'd seen Vince Marinello's mugshot on TV, she immediately knew, without a doubt, that he was the strange man on the bike she'd seen near the school.
Some of the most damning evidence presented against Marinello are his cell phone records, which the prosecution uses to disprove his alibi that he left Mississippi at 3:15 on the day his wife was shot.
2 hours before the shooting, at 1:58 p.m., Vince places a call that originated within a half-mile radius of the cell tower at 433 Metairie Road, which proves he was in the area where Liz had been shot.
At 4:51, Vince got an incoming phone call which revealed his cell phone was somewhere in the vicinity of Ponchatoula, Louisiana, which is approximately 45 miles from Metairie. In optimal traffic, a drive that far would take 43 minutes, which proves that Vince had time to shoot his wife in Metairie at 3:57 p.m. that afternoon.
On December 12th, Marinello takes the stand.
He admits that he authored the infamous checklist found on the table inside his FEMA trailer, but insists that he compiled it after the murder to prove his innocence.
As for the mustache, Marinello explains that he purchased it to change his appearance, noting that he's worn a toupee for years and already had the necessary adhesives.
The jury doesn't buy Vince's story. On December 13th, 2008, they find him guilty of second-degree murder.
The jurors will later say that the most convincing piece of evidence was the surveillance video.
On January 22, 2009, Vince Marinello is sentenced to life in prison. He suffers a heart attack 5 days later and undergoes life-saving surgery. Once he recovers, he's transferred to Angola prison.
I think Vince Marinello was really just an example of somebody who was so blinded by whether it was rage or his hate of his wife and wanting to kill her. He really thought that he was too smart, and he really isn't.